In higher ed, we're all looking for big wins, but reducing a 75% application abandonment rate and achieving a 90% conversion rate, that's next level transformation. Michael Bettersworth, CMO at Texas State Technical College, shares how they achieved this by streamlining the application process with Element 451.
Our Element journey began out of a necessity. We were switching to a new SIS, and the application process was going to pose some real usability issues for us. We felt that application was going to hamper our enrollment. So we began quickly to evaluate different CRMs, different applications. So for context on that, our conversion rate with the prior application had about 75% abandonment of people clicking apply to submit. And the first weeks after going live with Element, we saw an 80% conversion, and that's now up to 90. So improving the usability of that application on the front-end process has had a significant advance in our intake.
When technology works for students, it works for you. Visit element451.com to see how simplifying the application process with artificial intelligence will lead to significant results for your institution. Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where each week we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experiences. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology. The Higher Ed Geek Podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network, a robust collection of shows designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 272 with Brady Colby, returning to the show after a few years since his last visit with us. But he's here with us now, head of market research at Validated Insights, talking about their recently released reports, researching trends in the online program management markets. So I definitely have a lot of curiosity there. It's kind of where I came up in the EdTech scene. So I'm always curious to see and hear kind of what is happening, and kind of the big takeaway, the big kind of grabby headline that we break down in this episode is talking about institutions moving away from revenue share models in favor of fee for service partnerships. So really interesting stuff to kind of dig in why that is, and kind of what that means for the kind of ongoing story of digital education in higher ed. So really appreciate Brady and all that he does for the whole space here, digging in deep, doing a lot of kind of manual labor, kind of analyzing all the data that's out there to give us these great reports. So definitely go check it out at Validated Insights, this new report. And thanks so much for checking out this episode where we talk all about it. Episode number 272 with Brady Colby. I've been looking forward to our conversation here, just to kind of talk more about what you've been doing over the past little over a year with Validated Insights. We had talked on the podcast years ago, prior to this, you joining that team there, and also with the recent release as the recording of this episode of the kind of OPM report that you had put together. So always really appreciate kind of your insights on kind of this whole segment of the whole higher ed ecosystem. But before we get to any of that, talking about the report, if you want to just give a brief overview for folks of what Validated Insights does and like what your work specifically is there.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, we chatted a couple years ago, back whenever I was independent with 32 EDU, and back in November of 2023, we were acquired by Validated Insights. Validated Insights is a marketing agency that has specific expertise with online higher education and really lean into the agile approach. So they brought 32 EDU in-house, and we started spinning up the market research function as a standalone service and product offering at Validated Insights back in 2023. And we've been, over the past year and a half, been working on just expanding our capabilities and continuing on some of the work that was done whenever it was 32 EDU, which we'll talk about in this chat, and just really advancing, thought leadership and showing the industry, some interesting things that are going on.
Yeah, I always appreciate, I mean, just folks like yourself across the board that like actually do the work to get into the numbers and analyze things and put it all together. And also just like a very nice, nicely designed format and everything. So I think, so many times people are just sort of like, whatever it is that they're exposed to, or just sort of their like gut check on things is just what they think, is reality. So like when you can kind of get a reality check of being like, this is what's actually happening. We're going to put figures on a chart and like, set it in a context. And, I think it really makes sure to ground conversations, decision making. And certainly like for folks like myself, I want to make sure that I understand kind of what's happening writ large. So, we did, get the recent report that you all put out on kind of the online program management market and everything as it stands now. So if you want to just explain, what the report kind of was focusing on and how it kind of all came together.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight that you sort of touched on is how important it is to really get in the weeds with the data collection and doing more things manually than you think you ought to. There's obviously a ton of value to be added by automating a lot of processes, but whenever it comes to this alternative market data and these alternative indicators, it's really important to make sure that you're highly acquainted and that you're highly involved in the data aggregation piece, because I mean, specifically in the OPM space, so many of these providers are offering so many different services to institutions that, I mean, for example, Blackboard, there's Blackboard OPM partnerships, but there's also, countless other things that Blackboard Anthology does for institutions. So being really granular and manual in the process, it's really burdensome, but we think it really pays dividends. And that's been kind of a passion of mine, in part because I find it really interesting, and the other part because I know that there's a ton of things that pop up in higher education strategy conversations that are largely based on anecdotal evidence that, if somebody just spends the time on doing something, you can get to an answer. And we've been doing that not only with the OPM space, but our trade school report series also, just going through and saying like, all right, well, let's apply some classifications to schools and let's really drill down into what's actually going on. So yeah, we're definitely really passionate about the fact that there's a ton of data that can be harnessed, but it needs to be handled manually, at least until there's a little bit more sophistication in the automation tools.
Yeah, I guess, just to follow up on that, like, because I think putting stuff out there, I mean, anytime you create content, I guess, of any kind, you are sort of inviting yourself to be sort of kind of starting conversations, getting responses from people and thoughts and all that. And I think that idea of, any of these sort of research reports that come out of any number of organizations in higher education, you can, show your work and sort of do all of that. But it's even that idea of like, we're limited by like what we've got and the tools and everything. Cause like, it could be like, yes, if we could spend all the time in the world and do all this sort of stuff, it's like, yeah, maybe we can get like a report that looks different. But like, it is like in this moment, we also need stuff like this of what you're putting out. Like, we need as much of it as, quickly as possible. Like, the idea of reflecting back where you'd be like, well, because also we're recording this, I feel like I'm seeing the headlines where it's like, we're 5 years after the announcement of the global pandemic, and people might be saying like, oh, well, we analyzed this data from like 5 years ago. It took us this long to like get it and to look at it and do all that. And it's like, that is helpful to a point. We're all maybe in a reflective moment, as of recording this, but like you need to balance, I feel like, the rigor and the process with also like the timeliness of it as well. So just the idea of like, if you're, the give and take of that, just, yeah, like that's kind of just like baked in, I guess, of where like, I don't know if you just have reflections on that of how you kind of have to like navigate, balancing those two things.
I mean, yeah, you got to think the higher ed industry as a whole has gotten really accustomed to having really delayed data. I mean, you think, the gold standard of data, kind of the best thing that we have to work with is iPads data, and we're looking at, an 18-month to 2-year delay or lag on those, and often, depending on what indicator you're looking at, it's a lagging indicator as opposed to a leading indicator. So you're really, really looking way far back in time. So, we're getting a little bit more current with our indicators. There's obviously National Student Clearinghouse has been really useful, looking at search metrics, job postings, labor market data is something that is really viewed as a proxy for real-time or forward-looking information related to to higher ed. But whenever you talk about these alternative data points, this alternative market data, I think it's kind of astounding to step back and realize how accustomed we are to having really old data when that is just totally not the norm in other industries. You start looking at what's the landscape of alternative data providers whenever you're looking at different industries. And I mean, things are so much more up to date and current than we're accustomed to in higher education, and just realizing like, hey, we need to be really careful whenever we're looking at data that we just got, even though, we just got it because it's pretty old already. So, just trying to bring everything to as current as possible and get caught up with other industries.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's even just sort of, grounding acknowledgement for our conversation here is just, like how kind of education data comes out in terms of like, where are students enrolling and, modalities and everything else. But like the idea of like, well, let's just take it with a grain of salt. Cause like it's lagging and, it's not like bleeding edge data and everything. And it's different too, where like, because like any company obviously has access to their own data. They can kind of choose if it's like, oh, we're like going to let you know kind of what was going on last year with their own data and, to whatever else. And then like for this report, definitely like relying on data points from a variety of external organizations of like, I know the kind of headline grabbing kind of takeaway from this of the kind of trend lines around like fee for service versus rev share agreements and sort of how that's sort of developing in the OPM space. And I think that has been sort of this like quiet drum beating, kind of in the background that like I think people were sort of anticipating a little bit of like kind of a paradigm shift here. But, in terms of sort of like, takeaways and those sort of things, like, and, how this report, in particular came together analyzing, sort of the OPM marketplace. So if you just want to talk more about this report and just sort of like, things that were surprising to you in terms of developing it or the takeaways, just, we'll sit here for a little bit in our conversation, but it was really definitely really exciting for me. I feel like I came up in kind of the OPM space. This is my first ed tech job. So I always kind of have like a curiosity and kind of affinity for this stuff. So I'm excited to kind of just get into this. And yeah, just if you want to talk about sort of how you gather data for a report like this in particular, and then like what was sort of like standing out to you as you were kind of putting it together.
Yeah. So in terms of where the data comes from, we've been doing this for a little bit over 6 years now, but how it all got started was realizing that there's a lot of website metadata that can point you to what institutions are doing with different OPM providers. And then as you start getting into the weeds and start having to draw lines on what is and what isn't an OPM, then it gets into a whole discussion about, all right, now we just have to make sure that we're defining terms. And we really leaned into, you'll remember back around 2020, a lot of the HolonIQ work was talking about the unbundling of the OPM services and, the big OPM meet OPX report and a lot of the stuff that really spoke to the fact that, the bundle of services and how institutions are engaging with OPMs has been fundamentally changing. And that is reflected in our data. We were a part of working on that with HolonIQ. So what we did was really lean into the fact that there's a ton of information that can be gleaned from website metadata. As I mentioned, it's a super burdensome manual process to go out and collect that data. But then there's a ton of information that's available via institutional strategic planning documents, things that they publish on their domains about, what are their plans for online education, what are they doing there, obviously announcements, obviously partnership listings from OPMs, and then obviously the ones that make it kind of easy for you are the case of the MOOC platforms that, you can see right there who's doing what with who. So, it really just gets into a really manual process to go out and do a ton of brute force searching and digging through metadata to identify who's involved with what programs. But after, almost 7 years of doing it, we think we've got the hang of it pretty well.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate you kind of going a little bit more detailed in the explanation, because I think just like putting respect on your work and, your team and everything, like it is, kind of this tedious work, because it is like, that is what's required to kind of glean any of these kind of takeaways that folks can then make decisions on, or again, just inform perspectives or, and all of that. So again, yeah, like the big sort of banner takeaway, I think the pretty clear shift to fee for service being one of the big ones. So there are other maybe more subtle things that you'd want to like call out, because obviously folks can like look through the report, thoroughly themselves and kind of get all into kind of the weeds, but just sort of anything to kind of entice or tease folks that you feel like are kind of interesting things that you were able to get from all of this kind of analyzing that you were doing?
The big fee-for-service shift was obviously a big one. That's been something that's been posited or prognosticated that was coming for a long time. And it looked like things had kind of stagnated around 10 to 20% of the market in terms of new partnership activity. So it really looked like, hey, we're going to kind of stick here around this share of the market for fee for service. But then in 2024, we saw that a little bit more drastic shift, and that was really reflected by the fact that there was growth in fee for service partnerships, whereas there was, across the board, pretty significant declines. And I think one of the possible explanations that I've come up with for that is that there was a lot of revenue share agreements that were on hold. There was obviously some existential threats in the form of regulatory changes that threaten the future of revenue sharing OPM agreements. So I think there was a real weariness for institutions to enter into those kind of agreements. There was real financial pressures on online program management companies. We saw a lot of them moving to kind of subtly shift what their product offerings were to things that were really kind of workforce training, corporate training and development, upskilling kind of initiatives. So we saw it reflected that, a lot of these traditional revenue sharing OPMs were kind of altering their ultimate product offering to try and reflect, hey, we're not seeing as much demand, maybe because of the regulatory threats, maybe because of more institutions were not willing to enter into those partnerships because they didn't want to give up that revenue whenever they still had the increase in funding for online learning from the pandemic. So I think there was a real kind of temporary pause on these revenue sharing agreements. And one of the things that we did see, if you compare the report from the fall to this spring, it looked like 2024 was going to be a lot worse than it ended up being. The second half of 2024 ended up a little bit stronger than the first half. And so that kind of, while it was still, negative on the whole, it was still, it wasn't quite as negative as it could have been. So it seems like as schools started to get a little bit more clarity on the topics, there was a little less weariness to enter into new partnerships. But on the whole, in terms of the shift to fee for service, I think it reflects a real acknowledgement from institutions that they have more in-house capabilities, more in-house functionalities, more of an understanding of what it takes to design and deliver online programs, and that accordingly they have less of an appetite for this full bundle, this full suite of services. Obviously, that's not true in the case of every institution, which is why we still see demand for revenue sharing agreements with institutions that still have real felt needs that span the whole process of designing and delivering an online program. But as a lot of schools were forced to get accustomed to it, they came to the understanding that, hey, maybe this is just a piece of this is what we really need help with from a vendor. And then in those instances, they chose a fee-for-service approach to just tackle a specific function of the whole process. But yeah, other specific things that were interesting to me. One would be we did a big report earlier in this year about the MBA market, and we talked about how it seems like things kind of hit a bottom and that we might be getting back onto a growth trajectory. But even through that, we noticed that saturation was really ticking up, and that market's really, really getting saturated, and it's led to average online program sizes declining. Even with that being the case, OPMs are still overwhelmingly interested. That's still the program that they want. And I say that as measured by what programs they offer and what programs they're launching in a given year. Other ones that I think would be interesting, the shift in terms of who the market leaders are. There's been a lot of changes to the main providers and the main market leaders in the space, and kind of trying to get some hard data on, and getting to the point of having hard data on how that's all shaken out. And, obviously Rise Point, formerly Academic Partnerships, through their acquisitions, through their continued growth, has been the one that really took the leading spot in terms of market share in the space. Those would be kind of the two big takeaways from it for me.
Want to know what AI-powered, people-focused really looks like? The 2025 Engage Summit will show you how AI transforms engagement without losing the human touch. Join us June 24th through 25th in Charlotte for actionable insights, hands-on demos, and transformative strategies. Enrollify listeners save $50 with code Enrollify50. Sign up now at engage.element451.com. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all those. And I think, it is just kind of an interesting moment because I've even heard some other folks as they were kind of processing the report, the idea of like, I do think we just have to change kind of the conversation or the framing of it to just be like online program enablement, because I think just like the paradigm shift towards like more fee for service is going to mean where it's like, we do like maybe 75% of supporting our like, because even just like a broad scope of like distance education programs, that might include hybrid and fully online or whatever else, like, we do most of it in-house, but we work with the marketing agency or we work with like some instructional design support or, whatever else. So it's like, the idea of like, we wouldn't classically classify that as like an OPM partnership necessarily if they're just doing like one piece of it. So I think that even kind of like changes kind of the framing or sort of like, again, it's like you can make numbers say whatever you kind of want. So if somebody's doing like, oh, well, I don't know, like all the existing partnerships or whatever, it's like, I mean, like you could just look at it as like how many new partnerships signed within a given year, or a given time frame where a certain parameter, or then like were they all supporting marketing or are they supporting enrollment or are they supporting instructional design or whatever else. So I think that even that is just like we kind of, are kind of having this watershed moment. It's a little uncomfortable to kind of like have to change like vernacular or just how we kind of think of the framing of things. But that idea that like institutions can keep driving, their kind of strategy and get support where they need it, when they need it, how they need it kind of thing, and like, I think that is just kind of indicative of this moment is more sort of, having institutions be able to be more flexible, adaptable, responsive, and like not be so kind of fixed in kind of this traditional like rev share where you're sending so much money out the door and, they might be a longer term contract and, it's all or nothing, whether you need it all or not kind of thing. Like, I think, anybody would probably say is like, I would imagine that like we are past the moment of that feeling like the foregone conclusion or the predominant way that, institutions are going to be sort of building up their, digital education portfolio, even if there's like a lot of legacy still to sort of like, kind of wash away. But in this moment now, given everything we're able to kind of glean from the report and everything, like what does all this tell you, or what makes you maybe feel, kind of hopeful? Take it as you will, but I guess like, looking more towards the future, what does this tell you is going to be kind of coming in the future?
Well, fundamentally, it tells me that institutions are getting a better grasp of what they do well and what they need help with. So just having an understanding of what their capabilities are. It took us a pretty good amount of time to get to this place where institutions had a really solid understanding of, what it takes to design and deliver online programs, where they needed help, what they really excelled at. So having that firm understanding of what they can do, what they believe their core competencies are, what they believe they need vendor assistance with, really enables institutions to expand access via online learning. They're not necessarily in the position of just kind of throwing their hat in the ring of online learning. They're able to be a lot more strategic. And so that means that institutions are able to get a lot more specific with, hey, we understand our ability to operate in this space pretty well now. So what are the academic offerings that we have that the labor market, the education market as a whole would really benefit from us innovating and going online with and expanding access? So it really creates this opportunity where institutions are able to really be back in the driver's seat of what kind of education do we provide for the country, our region as a whole? What kind of things does the workforce look to us for? And not just necessarily having to lump into the bucket of what are the fastest growing and largest online programs, but being able to understand, hey, we're really good at X niche subject, and historically, if we were going into a revenue share agreement, nobody's going to, sign on to do this with us because it's just too niche. But, we're able to make the finances work on this because we're able to engage in specific vendor partnerships that make the math add up. So it really creates a situation where schools are able to dictate what they're putting out into the market and really match what they do well from an academic standpoint to what they're making available to students.
Yeah, I think that's a great take. And I think that what will drive like the future of digital education is exactly that of like, if we have more different types of programs offered by more different kinds of institutions and everything, like, because there's the presumption that like, based on like, the preferences of OPMs, if they had it their way, they'd be, spinning up MBAs everywhere. Everybody would just getting, business degrees, I guess. But, the idea that like folks earnestly may want to study, like niche disciplines and stuff, remotely. And so I think, that'll be interesting to see how that kind of takes shape. And I think even just like the variety of, vendors that would be sort of OPE partners and stuff, like that they could also position themselves to be sort of able to enable those more niche, programs versus being kind of like, oh, well, it's all just sort of like scale above all else kind of thing. So I think it'll be kind of an interesting next few years. And I guess as we're wrapping up here, any advice or calls to action for other higher ed leaders out there right now? Certainly, the folks in kind of the digital education space, at institutions, enabling, those offerings, just advice that you'd have for folks out there listening right now.
Kind of following along that same line of thinking, we're at a place now where just simply throwing your hat in the ring and saying, we're offering our program online, that's not a differentiator anymore. So you have to get back to the way of thinking of saying, what are our true differentiators? What, like academically, what do we do really well? Where do we have, particular alignment with the workforce? Just what are the things that really draw students to us regardless of modality? And then really leaning into optimizing your online portfolio based on those categories, and not just viewing, hey, we're going to offer this program online and it's going to grow, because that's not necessarily a given anymore. And I don't know that it's true that I don't know that it really has ever been. It's always been, a bit of a bet. So we're getting back to this space where institutions aren't just looking at online like a magic bullet, and they're able to think about, what is my institution? What's the mission of my institution? What do we do well? What are we trying to accomplish with this given program, and really be able to increase the value for students? I'd say really focusing on that, because as much as I hate the term, we're at this new normal now where, online programs are, they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere now. And so you have to go back to applying that same line of thinking to saying, what makes us different? And that's how I would encourage folks to think about next steps and what they're going to do in the market next.
It's great advice. Yeah. And I mean, and I saw like a great way to look at this of, if you had like, an ad or some sort of piece of content, promoting something, program at your institution, if you could just like swap the logo or do whatever and it would like read exactly the same, it's like, you're not doing that enough. So like, that's like a good manifestation that I just saw the other day of what you're saying is like, you got to be imbuing the messaging, whether it's like, we because even sometimes it's just the practical stuff of like, hey, like, we're cheaper than the other ones. Like we, the way that we've approached this and created kind of the budget around it, like we're just going to be the cheaper option. Like we provide a lot of the same service and offerings, and like, it's like, yeah, that's different. Or like some institutions are going to be, spiritually affiliated, and then you could, lean into that. Or like the, smaller class sizes or the duration of the program. Like, some of those, that's like the basic building blocks versus it just being like, again, the same generic kind of things that where, the way people kind of frame higher ed. But yeah, I mean, that's going to become, like I think has always been the case and has become that much more important. And even the idea of like, just with what we were saying, if it's like, if you have like something that makes you very distinct from like, an academic perspective, and you do some research and be like, nobody else offers this online, I think we could do it. And we could be like, we could differentiate ourselves that way in our messaging and being like the only online blank program out there, and like, it's like, go for it, man. Like, and, you could, really kind of expand your, enrollment that way and everything. But I think even the idea of like, the advice of kind of level setting expectations, right sizing sort of the budget or the investment that you're making and all that, like, I think that's going to be kind of indicative of this moment as well, is that like, I think the rev share, online program kind of moment, in my mind, that's sort of like kind of warped the incentives of like, well, we got to get as many students as possible, paying as much as possible. And then we're, splitting the difference and we're, doing all this stuff. And it's like, obviously at the end of the day, like the students are ill-served. And that's what all this sort of like, kind of consternation was about, right, that I think helped, kind of propel us to this moment. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Great advice. Just really appreciate all that you do to kind of, just crunch the numbers and get into the weeds and pull it all together for us to help inform, folks' perspectives here in the higher ed space. But ways to connect with you and to look at the report in the show notes. And just thank you so much again for all you do and for taking time out to chat with me for the podcast here.
Absolutely. Great to chat.
The Hired Geek Podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances you'll like all the other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing constantly, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks all designed to empower you to be a better hired professional. Our shows help you find your next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your host. Learn from people like Jamie Hunt, Seth Odell, Dave Kibbolds, and Eddie Francis, as well as so many other of your favorite leaders in higher education. Enrollify is made possible by the support of Element 451, the leading AI-powered, all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.